Dr. Anthony Chaffee, thanks very much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
No.
I wanted to start off, with saying that when we're young, we hear from pretty much everyone, our parents, everyone tells us we've got to eat our vegetables to grow up strong and healthy. But you famously say that plants are trying to kill us. Why is that?
It's being slightly facetious. I mean, it's really a quote that I took from my own professor of cancer biology when I was doing my undergraduate degree, and he was trying to relay upon us that plants are living organisms, and they like to stay living organisms, and so they have a series of defenses that are chemical in nature. So all living things have a defense, otherwise they would have gone extinct by now. And if there weren't as robust a defense as they needed. So while animals can run away and fight back, plants can't. And so they have chemical deterrence as their main weapon. So we have cataloged, counted, and named nearly 1 million defense chemicals that plants make that can be directly toxic. They can be disruptive to our physiology. They can disrupt our hormones. They can cause other sorts of impairments. They can disrupt the digestion and absorption of other nutrients, and so on and so on and so on. So there are quite a lot of robust defenses that plants have. Now, a plant is trying to kill you in the same regard as a moose or a bison is trying to kill you. It's not that it's hunting you and it wants you dead. It's just that you get too close to a bison or a moose and it feels threatened. It will take you out because it's kill or be killed in the wild for plants as well as animals. And so if you threaten that plant, it is more than happy for you to die if it gets to live. And people say, well, they don't necessarily have a conscious choice in this matter. Not necessarily the case. More and more botanists are coming out now saying that plants are actually quite sentient, and they have a nervous system that relays and responds to injuries and attacks and different sorts of stimuli, very similar to our central nervous system. So they don't have a centralized nervous system or a brain, but their entire body acts like a central nervous system. So they don't have a brain, they act like a brain. They have receptors on the surface of their bodies that are the same protein photoreceptors that we have in the back of our retina that recognize different frequencies of light. So that while they don't have eyes, they are eyes, and they can actually see around them. They speak to each other. They communicate through their roots, through vibrations, through chemical signals sent through the air. And they're actually quite sophisticated in a lot of ways. In fact, some botanists are saying that they display features that denote personhood and individuality, which is pretty remarkable. So these plants are like every other living thing, and they have to defend themselves, and they have to defend themselves in robust nature. Think about it this way. Latex, we use latex gloves in medicine all the time. Latex is, and a lot of things we use in medicine are from plants. A lot of them are toxins that we find is helpful in certain cases. Penicillin, that's a toxin that's made from mold that kills bacteria, right? So there's this constant war in nature, and we use that to our advantage in certain circumstances. So latex is actually a sap that's secreted from certain plants, and it's when they're sort of crushed and chewed that they start releasing this really thick, sticky sap with latex in it. And what happens is when the animal is eating that plant and it releases all this latex, it actually glues their mouth shut. And so, it's a pretty elegant way to stop something from eating you is gluing its mouth shut. But the reality is that animal typically can't get its mouth unglued. And so they die and they starve slowly to death over the course of the next couple of weeks, or they get taken out by something else. So the plant really has no problem with you dying if it gets to live. And in fact, the majority of plants on Earth will kill you if you eat them, even in small quantities. And there are some plants that if you just get too close to them and breathe in the chemicals that they're exuding in a defensive nature around them, you can die just from inhaling the chemicals that they exude. There's a garden in England, and on the gates it says, beware, these plants can kill. And there are plants, of that nature that you get too close to them and disturb them, and they can actually kill you. And in fact, I think one of their head groundskeepers actually did die. Maybe a couple other people who worked there have died as well by getting too close to these plants and breathing in their fumes. So, it's not that they're actively hunting us and trying to kill us, but they're trying to defend themselves just like everything else. And if that means that you have to die so they get to live, so be it. They're more than happy to do it. Just like if you get too close to a moose, it will stomp you out because it's not trying to eat you, but it's trying to make sure that you don't eat it.
It's quite incredible, actually, because I think that's not what the majority of people think when they think of plants as I mean, it is living, but they don't really think of it the same way they would think of an animal,
Yeah, no, they don't. But we for a long time didn't think that animals felt pain and that we could abuse them and do anything we wanted to them because they didn't feel pain like we did, so it didn't count. You could be nasty and horrible to them. Obviously, that's not the case. They just because they can't scream out in English, "Hey, that hurts," you can still see them yelling and screaming. So plants yell and scream in a different way, but they do yell. And in fact, there are papers that have been published that are just called, plants scream, and they can scream out chemical signals, screaming to other plants that they're being attacked, that they're being killed, and to defend themselves, like, hey, we're being attacked, defend yourselves. They send signals through their roots to other plants. They send vibrational signals to other plants, and those other plants around them start responding and start upregulating more and more toxins. So this is a good reason why people will tend to, well, it's the folk wisdom you may have been taught by your mother or parent or something like that, that when you're looking for produce, if it has like signs of like an insect biting it or burrowing in, even if that insect is gone, I mean, you don't eat that one, that one's bad. Well, why is it bad? Is there bacteria on it? Is it infected? No, what it is that insect started eating that, and the plant started defending itself, started making more and more toxins to drive that away. And that's why it didn't get completely eaten. It just had a chunk of it bitten out, and then it got too toxic and it started tasting horrible. And so the bug took off and went somewhere else. But that means that that's upregulated a lot of those toxins. And so that can be more harmful if you eat something that has a blemish or has, like fungus started attacking it or something like that as well. So it's not, the information is out there. It's just, how we're gathering this information is generally through hearsay and propaganda. It's plants are great for you, meat's going to kill you, saturated fat's going to give you a heart attack, and so you have to eat anything else by definition is therefore good for you as long as it doesn't have saturated fat and it's not from an animal. And that's sort of what's been going on for the last 40 years, and it's just complete rubbish. I mean, just because something is something different, if you're calling one thing bad for you, just being something else doesn't necessarily make it good for you. It just means it's not that one thing. So even if something didn't contain saturated fat, if saturated fat were bad for you, which it is not, just because something didn't have saturated fat doesn't mean it's de facto good for you. But that is exactly the argument that was made. And so these fruits and vegetables didn't have saturated fat. And so then they said, okay, yeah, they're all good for you. The only thing people started avoiding was saturated fat. So, it's not an education. Like, that's not what botany teaches us. That's not what biology teaches us. That's not what the hard sciences show. The hard sciences show that plants and animals are in an evolutionary arms race. Plants becoming more and more toxic, so less and less animals can eat them so they can survive and thrive. And animals becoming more and more adapted to specific toxins in specific plants so they can eat that plant and survive and thrive. And this is why out of the 400,000 plants in the world, most of them will kill you. And in fact, most plants will kill most animals, even herbivores, because herbivores have to be specially adapted to the plants that they eat as well. And so while a koala eats eucalyptus and almost nothing else eats eucalyptus because they're so toxic, koalas don't eat anything else because those other things would be toxic to a koala. And so we eat avocados and grapes, but avocados and grapes will kill cats and dogs. because they have less defenses towards the toxins in grapes and avocados. And obviously, grapes and avocados do have toxins, or else they wouldn't kill dogs and cats. Chocolate, same thing. That can be toxic to dogs at certain levels. And there's reasons for that. It disrupts their physiology in certain ways that will result in death. And we forget this fact, and we forget the fact that these things have toxins, and that we have not been exposed to these toxins for really more than 10,000 years in any meaningful way, and that more native populations that have more recently turned to a post-agricultural way of eating in the last 100, 150 years, like Native Americans, the indigenous Australians, several populations in sub-Saharan Africa, etc., the Inuit, that these peoples were largely hunter-gatherers, mostly hunters. They gathered if the hunt wasn't successful, and if they could get meat, they ate meat. Plants were a backup, sort of a starvation of food, and if they had to, by and large. And now they're, as in a post-agricultural society, they get far more sick than people of Western descent who have been exposed to agriculture for 10,000 years or so. And that's really telling. We've had, Europeans and others have had about 10,000 years to be exposed to these plant toxins and start to try to get a bit of a defense against them. But these other native populations that came more recently to a post-agricultural way of eating, a Western society, a Western diet, which in anthropology, they talk about specifically when you come from a pre-agricultural society, it's hunter-gatherer population, basically you're dealing with injuries and infectious disease, and they live just as long, if not longer, than the rest of us. It's just that infant mortality rate's high, so the average life expectancy is lower. But how long people live before they die of old age is as long or longer than people in the West, and they don't get these chronic diseases. But when they move to civilized so-called societies, these post-agricultural societies, Western societies, all of a sudden there's a massive shift in what they get afflicted with, and it's now not predominantly infectious disease and injuries like it would have mostly been in the 17 and 1800s for us, but it's chronic disease. That's the major burden of disease, and that's the major burden of disease around the world. 90% of deaths in the Western world are from chronic diseases. 74% of deaths around the world are from chronic diseases. So this is, this is a major, major issue. And I think that it is very clear that this is nearly exclusively caused by eating a species inappropriate diet, a biologically inappropriate diet. We need to go back to what certainly getting rid of processed food, but even before processed food, people were still getting these different sorts of diseases at much, much lower rates. And they called them diseases of the West because only Westerners got them. Only people in post-agricultural societies got them. But then when pre-agricultural societies like the Native Americans, etc., shifted to a post-agricultural society, then they all started getting them, and at much higher rates. So I think that's very cut and dry. And then when you move back and you start eating to our biological design, the way that humans have been eating since humans have been humans, humans have been apex predators for at least 2 million years, if not longer. We have very clear evidence that humans have been thriving in the Arctic Circle during the ice ages at a time when the Great Plains in North America, were under a mile-high block of ice. And you're talking about 2,000 miles north of that. What exactly is there to eat besides animals, right? I mean, nothing's growing. Certainly not growing wheat. We only turned to agriculture about 10,000 years ago. And we know that because we only started producing things like amylase, which is an enzyme that breaks down plant starches into a constituent glucose molecules. That only hit the genome about 10,000 years ago. It's very, very recent. And then in these agricultural societies, it spread very widely, but not in the other societies that did not go to agriculture at that time. And then as populations shifted to agriculture, they started picking up this trait for production of amylase. So that's very clear to me. You go back to eating what humans were eating during an ice age in the Arctic Circle, And all of a sudden, people's health issues are going away. Their diabetes goes away. Their autoimmunity goes away. And heart, hypertension, high blood pressure starts going away. Start putting on muscle, they lose fat. Their Alzheimer's starts to improve, or they never form it in the first place. All these sorts of things are massively improving people's health, and it's such a simple thing. And we see it, this cause and effect relationship when people are eating the way humans have always been eating, or even close to that, they don't get these diseases. And then they shift to a post agricultural modern society way of eating, and they get these diseases of civilization as described in anthropology textbooks. And then you go back and eat, a traditional way, it goes away for all populations. So to me, it's probably one of the most obvious things that exists on this earth.
It is crazy to me with diet that it's seen as healthy to have all this processed food, and now there's this movement that meat is bad, and the plant-based diet and this and that. And it's fine to have a processed burger that tastes like beef, but it's nothing to do with beef. Now that is considered healthy, but to have a steak is not. And it's just like mind-boggling to me that people believe this. And if you think about, as you said, like thinking about what our ancestors must have eaten, surely that must be the best way to eat. I mean, animals don't get, unless they're our pets, animals don't get diabetes and things like that. They know what to do. People were born with the right sort of instincts, but we've messed that up over the last however many 100 years.
Well, and that's a great point too, because it's our domesticated pets that get the exact same diseases that we get. The only animals on Earth that get these diseases are humans and the animals that eat human food, right? And in fact, vets now are saying that there's this massive increase in the rates of so-called human diseases, which are just the diseases of civilization, in the pet populations. And of course, that only happens when you feed them kibble and other sorts of man-made foods instead of just feeding them what they're supposed to eat. Dogs and cats are known carnivores, and we're giving them grain and plant-based kibble because it makes these companies a lot of money. We worry about processed foods, but then we don't realize that pet food, dog and cat food, is largely owned by the processed food manufacturers like Mars bars. They make dog and cat food, and they call it like, sexy names like, ooh, science diet. Ooh, science told us, put this exactly what should eat. Science tells us that dogs should eat meat. Science tells us that cats have to eat meat. So this is it's marketing. They're calling it science, like, ooh, this is the best. A bone with meat on it, that's the best. And that's obvious. An animal that they just caught and are eating, that is the best, obviously. You can't mimic that with grains and plants because A, they don't have the same nutrition, and B, they have a lot of toxic elements that cause harm. That's all there is to it. Wolves in the wild, when eating their natural diet, are in ketosis. They do not eat carbohydrates. Lions in the wild are in ketosis. They have tested this. And of course they would be. They're not eating carbohydrates, they're getting fat and protein. So why would we think putting a dog or a cat on a heavily carbohydrate rich diet, spiking their insulin and taking them out of ketosis, would be a good idea? Obviously, it's very unlikely to do that. There's an immutable law in biology, is that of adaptation. What a species has been adapting to and exposed to the longest is what is they are best equipped to deal with. And humans have been eating meat for literally millions of years, multiple millions of years. We've been apex predators for over 2 million years. That's what all the best evidence shows. And apex predators, by definition, are carnivores. And then you look at felines and canines, and they've been carnivores for far longer than that. And we're saying, no, this plant, aka wheat or corn or soy, that is a human construction that did not exist in nature before we bred it and created it. No, that's the ideal food stuff for all of the above. That doesn't make any sense. We haven't been adapting to this at all for any length of time. 10,000 years is a blink of the eye in regards to just human existence. If we're talking about the entire existence of the human species, it's literally just a fraction of our existence. There was some sort of analogy. Someone said, if you had an entire like football field, 100-meter field, and that was all of human existence, we would have been eating meat all the way up until like the last centimeter, and that's agriculture. And now it's like 2 blades of grass, and like that's it. That's the only time we've actually been eating plants. The rest of the time we've just been eating meat. So we're heavily adapted to eating meat. We know that that's not harmful. There are no toxic elements in meat. The saturated fat does not cause heart disease. That is a pure con, because that was pushed by the mostly the sugar manufacturers and processed food companies, and potentially the tobacco companies as well, who then bought up most of these food companies in the 80s. They pushed that because they needed to protect their own investment in their processed food and garbage that they were selling, because that was very likely to be the cause of cardiovascular disease. So they needed to pick a scapegoat, and they just dumped money behind it and paid off some of the most prominent professors and researchers in the world from Harvard and elsewhere to lie and say this stuff. And one of those professors was named head of the USDA, and he was he was the one who authored and published the USDA declaration in the late 70s, saying that cholesterol causes heart disease, saturated fat increases cholesterol, stop eating both, this is going to kill you. And we still listen to this nonsense, even though it's in direct contravention of the published data and evidence. So much so that the U.S. dietary guidelines and recommendations in 2015 were actually changed, and they removed the recommendation to limit the amount of dietary saturated fat and cholesterol. Because as they said, there's absolutely no evidence that dietary cholesterol or saturated fat has any effect on your serum blood levels of cholesterol, and has absolutely no impact on the development of cardiovascular disease. So they said this is a non-issue anymore, and we shouldn't be worrying about it. They removed this as a substance of concern in the diet, and yet people are still a decade later screaming this from the rooftops. Oh, limit your saturated fat to less than 10%. Well, if you want to go more than that, because recommendations are just it's just expert opinion. That's the lowest tier on the evidence hierarchy. Okay, well, let's go to the very top. The tippy top of that pyramid is an umbrella review. So you have high quality randomized control trials, because you can have poor quality randomized control trials, but high quality randomized control trials, and that can tell you something. And then you make a meta-analysis of those high quality randomized control trials, and that gives you even stronger evidence. But then when you amass enough meta-analyses of high quality randomized control trials, you can actually do a meta-analysis of those meta-analyses, and that's called an umbrella review. So what the Journal of the American College of Cardiology published in 2020, a meta-analysis of meta-analyses of all the randomized control trials, looking at the connection between dietary saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. And they found absolutely no relationship whatsoever between the intake of saturated fat and cardiovascular disease. But in fact, they found an inverse relationship between saturated fat intake and strokes. So people that ate more saturated fat actually had less strokes, and people who ate less saturated fat actually had more strokes. And yet we are still trying to tell people that saturated fat, you have to avoid it. This is so bad for you. This is absolutely against the available evidence at the highest level of evidence. This is not opinion. This is not conjecture. This is fact. And when you look back at the original vilification of saturated fat and cholesterol, you actually see that it was a complete con and a fraud. And we have hard evidence of that as well, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2016, when they published actual internal memos from the sugar companies detailing how they paid off professors from Harvard and elsewhere to falsify data and publish fraudulent studies, and how one of those professors became head of the USDA. So that's where I got that. I got that from one of the top medical journals in the world. This is published literature. This is not conjecture. This is not an accusation. This is a matter of historical record. They made it up. They lied, and it has been substantially disproven since then, and it needs to go away and die.
I want to dig definitely dig much deeper into that. But before we do, just to come back to you for a second, maybe you could tell the audience a little bit more about who you are and how what led you onto this sort of journey of health and nutrition, because your main focus for you was the brain, and so what sort of led you into this direction?
Yeah, I'm a medical doctor, and I have a private practice here in Australia, although I'm from America. I've been specializing in neurosurgery as a registrar here, and but also I have a private practice in metabolic health, preventative medicine, and just health optimization. Using lifestyle and dietary and lifestyle interventions to try to get people as healthy as possible, and we are just seeing massive improvements in people's health. So much so that I can't not do this. It's not. I don't think it would be ethical for me to stop, because I just see it helping so many people in so many profound ways. What got me into this? Well, initially, like I said, I had a professor of cancer biology who told us how toxic plants were and how they were very carcinogenic, and said to us that he didn't eat salads or vegetables and wouldn't let his kids eat vegetables because, in his words, plants are trying to kill you. So the what was left hanging there was that, well, why the hell would you eat these things? Like, they're toxic, they're trying to kill you. What's wrong with you? And so I stopped at that point, and I just went to the grocery store. I'm like, well, what in God's name do I eat? And I just was walking around. I was like, everything's has plants in it. I mean, that was my only standard. It was just like, can't have plants. That was the only thing I cared about. And so it was just everything. I was walking through, everything had plants in it. And I just walked by some eggs and meat, and I was like, okay, eggs and meat it is. And that's what I ate for 5 years. I've never felt better. I felt absolutely amazing. I was worried about, vitamin deficiencies. I remember thinking, I was like, oh, do I need to like take a multivitamin or eat a banana or something? And I was just like, well, yeah, I mean, I feel good. My gums aren't bleeding. So, I'm just going to ride this out. That was an actual conversation I had in my head verbatim. I was like, what do I do? I was like, all right, let's ride this out, see what happens. And I felt amazing. I just felt better and better as I went. There wasn't any issues. And, you sort of slip off these things because, you just get inundated with, but you need this, you need that, and this research, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, yeah, I don't know, because it has these toxins and carcinogens, like, but you have to have mushrooms because it has anti-VEGF, and that's an anti-carcinogen, and it's good against cancer. And I was like, yeah, but it has carcinogens in it. Like, well, why are you taking, and also I don't have cancer, so why am I taking anti-VEGF, which it was a chemotherapy agent. So like, why would I be taking chemo if I don't have cancer? It doesn't make sense, because you wouldn't just take any other chemo drugs, because they would hurt you. That would cause a lot of harm. And they have carcinogens. I was like, that doesn't really make sense. But I was just like, I don't know. And you just go along with these things because you just have, it's coming from so many directions. You're like, oh, okay, I guess. And I never felt as good as I did during those 5 years. And I never knew why. I didn't chalk it up to that. I didn't see that at the time. It wasn't for several years later, actually 12 years later, that I came back to this and realized that no, humans just really are carnivores as a species. We've been apex predators for millions of years. I learned that in second grade. And that's what I was doing. I was living as a carnivore. I was living to our biological design. That's when I've never felt better in my entire life during that period. And so I said, that's what I was doing. I've never been able to figure it out. That's what it was. I just chalked it up to age. I just, at 25, I felt like a superhero. At 25 and a half, I did not. And I couldn't figure out what happened. And then I did at 38, finally, but I guess better late than never. And I just,
so you'd gone back to non-carnivore at that point.
Yeah, I just sort of went back to just mostly eating meat, because that was always what I preferred anyway. But just adding in some salads, salads or veggies or something like that. Never really ate much fruit, but yeah, a bit here and there. But yeah, mostly like salads and meat. I wasn't really a big bread guy. Every now and then, if it was like easy, like when I was studying for the MCATs, it was just easy to get a whole bunch of like whole wheat pasta, and I just boil it up real quick and have a whole big thing of pasta and just eat that real quick, and then study for the afternoon. And I never really realized it, but I would pass out like a couple hours later. I would just get exhausted, and I pass out on the couch and sleep for 2 hours, and then wake up and keep studying. And like, That was this this carb coma that I would go into after I ate pasta. Because you actually get that because you eat these carbohydrates. Carbohydrates at past a certain level are actually directly toxic to your body. This is what kills diabetics, is the toxic nature of carbohydrates past a certain point. And so your body is trying to protect you by detoxifying this. So your body responds to glucose past a certain level as a toxin and responds to it by detoxifying it, which is how you know it's a toxin. And so insulin goes up, it stays up, and then blood sugar drops down. You get what's called reactive hypoglycemia, and you just get tired and your blood sugar drops, and you just take a nap if you can, or you have to just suffer and drink a bunch of coffee if you can't. And looking back, that's what it was. But yeah, I switched back to, I've always eaten very clean. I never ate junk food. I'd have pizza once every few years, maybe. I mean, it was just never something that was a major part of my diet. We always cooked all our meals. My mom cooked every meal at home, apart from like cereal in the mornings. And when I was an adult, I did the same. And most of that was meat, and I would have some other stuff with it because you're supposed to have other stuff with it. And that was pretty much it. And so I went back to a very clean, whole food, mostly meat, probably ketogenic most of the time because I just didn't buy a bunch of bread and eat carbs all that much. Sort of diet with a bunch of like clean veggies. I mean, like on paper, you'd think that was a really, really healthy diet, and it's a lot healthier than a lot of other people. But I felt 1,000 times better at 38 when I just dropped the veggies and started eating a lot more fatty meat. I felt like I was 22 again. And I started performing like I was 22 again. I actually went out and started playing rugby again and just was right back into it and felt amazing, even though I was insanely out of shape. I hadn't played rugby in 3 years, a full season in 3 years anyway. And just felt amazing and was able to compete at a high level again. And actually go back and start playing professionally again in Seattle. My team in Seattle that I grew up playing with, they'd gone fully professional at that point with the start of the MLR, the Major League Rugby. And so that was the first season. I was like, I really want to play in this season. And I was back and feeling great and getting back in shape. Unfortunately, I had a knee injury, but it was just, I felt absolutely incredible from a fitness health point of view. There's no issues there. And then at that point, I really started getting really interested in this concept and how much better I was feeling. And I started really digging into the literature and trying to find out as much as I could. And I realized that there was this massive body of medical and biological, physiological literature out there that you never get taught in medical school or residency. It's just completely outside the scope of teaching there. And the reality is because it's the curriculum is largely dictated by the food and drug companies. We're the major sponsors of these institutions. Unfortunately, they're also the major sponsors of the scientific journals, which I actually found out recently, and they actually can block out and say who gets published where or even gets reviewed to publish a paper because they don't want things going against their product. And so they can say, hey, we're going to pull funding if you look at that paper. And so people are finding it actually very difficult, like some of the top professors from MIT, like Professor Stephanie Seneff. She went to MIT for undergrad and grad school, PhD there in computer science, right? So she's smart cookie, right? And top 1% of the top 1%. And she has been a professor at MIT ever since. So she's been a tenured professor in computer science for 40 years or so. And then she started doing, biological studies and studying glyphosate and its effects on human health. And she was saying that it's actually very difficult to get published, even as a 40-year tenured professor at MIT, because of this issue that they just have this block and stranglehold, even on the scientific medical or scientific journals. And so there are papers out there, though. There are thousands upon thousands upon thousands of papers out there and studies show randomized controlled trials, large scale human subjects that show massive improvements to human health and reversal of many diseases And it's, begs a question, why isn't this taught in medical school? And that is a legitimate question, because this works better than drugs in a lot of cases. And so, it's a direct competition with these drug companies, and they're the ones who help dictate the curriculum. But the data is there. It's just that people don't realize it. They think, well, if it was fit to print, then I would have been taught it in medical school or residency. And if it wasn't taught to me there, that means it doesn't exist. And so you talk to them, so, well, there's no evidence to show that diet has anything to do with disease or condition X. And what that really means is that they have no idea. They just haven't looked, because because a lot of the time it is there. And so, a good thing to do is say, you ask them about that. No, there's no evidence for that. And that question is like, have you looked? Because actually there is a lot of evidence. It's just not spoon fed to us. And so that's sort of been my crusade here for the last several years, is trying to get this information out to the mainstream. I've obviously seen its direct effect on my life, my family's life, and now my patient's life. And I'm seeing the evidence. I'm seeing this absolute iceberg of information that is just out of sight for people. And they just, they don't even know to look for it. You don't know what you don't know. And they say they don't even look for it. I started asking questions. I said, well, if this is the case, we should see evidence for this. I just started searching for studies, anything that could compare, these two different contrasting situations, and trying to find evidence with which to test these theories against. And I found endless supplies of studies of high quality and merit that just don't get taught you in medical school, because they don't have a product behind it. So there's no marketing team behind it to push this out there. And so now, putting this into practice and having treated hundreds of patients, if not thousands of patients directly in my clinic, in my practice, I've seen massive improvements. I mean, things that just are right now considered incurable. They cannot be treated. They cannot be cured. They can only treat the symptoms. No, you can cure it if you know what's causing it. You just have to, you have to address the root cause. And so that's what I've been doing. And I've been putting this out there for free online, telling people, showing people the evidence, and showing them people who have healed different things. And then you look in the comments, you'll see hundreds, if not thousands of people saying, that was me. I did that a few years ago. I'm going through it now. I'm coming off my medications, all these other sorts of things. A theory is only good as what it's able to predict. And so it's, it's a bit telling when people go on a carnivore diet and the benefits that they receive are exactly what are laid out every time and time again. You get this very clear progression and improvement. And so it's just very important to me to get this out to people, so that they can take their health into their own hands, and they don't have to be beholden to the medical establishment, and they don't have to be beholden to taking all these medications and supplements and thises and that's and whatever. They can just eat food and be healthy. The natural state of all life on earth is that of health. And we are the most successful species that has ever walked the earth. And so we should be the healthiest and most robust species on earth, and yet we're the sickest. Okay, so that's not genetic. That's not part of our species. That's not inbuilt in us. That's happening to us. And we're seeing this in real time. Every decade, we're getting more and more sick. And so obviously that's environmental. That's not anything we're innately built with. So that's very important to me, to let people understand how to take back control of their own health, and only need the medical establishment when there's an actual emergency, like an injury or infectious disease that they can't clear on their own. And to educate doctors as well and get them on this board, because it's so important for the medical establishment to really understand this as well, and know, hey, look, there's actually better evidence here for other treatments, and they work better for patients and get better outcomes, and they don't cost a fortune. And so that's obviously better for your patient. And the more doctors that come across this, that I speak to, or that see it for themselves, the more people that are on board with this, because the evidence is absolutely there, and they're seeing this as well. It's not just me. It's not just a few others. This is tens of thousands of doctors around the world at this point.
It is mind blowing. That there is very little, if any, focus on nutrition in medical school. I know a few people personally that have recently finished their medical training, and they said they they did almost nothing about nutrition. And even modern doctors now. My family doctor, when I mentioned something about carnivore or something, they look at me like, that's not a good idea, like, and watch your saturated fat. And but the marketing and propaganda is just, it's incredible how powerful it is. And I mean, even with something like alcohol, I mean, I don't drink, and if you go out with friends and I say, no, I just want to have some water, people look at you like you're weird. They're like, what is wrong with you? Or they think that you've been an alcoholic. There must be some reason why you're not drinking. But if you went out and you told people, oh, I don't drink water, I just drink juice and alcohol and go out and drink, but I don't drink water, I don't like water, they wouldn't give it a second thought. They'd be, oh, okay, that's fine. So that's considered normal. But if you tell people you want to drink water, then it's not normal. I mean, it's so backwards. And yeah, with the nutrition and supplements, I mean, that also to me doesn't make sense. That saying that meat is bad, but yet you can get everything you need from meat. And if you're on a plant-based diet, you need supplement. So why would a diet where you need to supplement be better than a diet where you don't need to supplement? I mean, I don't know. I mean, just from a logical point of view, I'm not a doctor myself, but that just makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Well, you're not a doctor, but you have a brain. And so you can think and see what's in front of you, and you don't need to be a doctor to have common sense. And, in fact, a lot of doctors are probably lacking in that regard. So, common sense, unfortunately, is not all that common anymore. They used to say, like, wisdom from the mouth of babes. What does that mean? That just means, a kid that's just looking at the world fresh and going like, that doesn't make sense. What the hell are you talking about? And that's what we need to get back to, because we've been taught how to think and what to think, or sorry, they were taught what to think as opposed to how to think, and they've pigeonholed our brains to just do what we're told. So we don't actually know how to think critically and look at something and go, wait, hold on a second, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't pass the smell test. Because you're right. If a diet is lacking in nutrients, if you have to supplement, then by definition your diet is deficient, right? That's a definition in terms. Well, it could be soil, whatever. It's deficient. You're not getting the nutrients that you require. Now you may have a malabsorption issue, but if your diet just on its face cannot provide certain nutrients like B12 or D3 or K2 or DHA or EPA or retinol, or the list goes on, then that is a deficient diet. That is not an appropriate diet. And obviously it's not our evolved diet, because we would die, right? And meat has absolutely everything we need in the proportion that we need it. How do we know that? Because there are people that eat meat exclusively and nothing else, generation after generation after generation, in societies alive right now that have absolutely no issues. And if you're deficient by 1% in only one nutrient, you cannot do that. You cannot live generation after generation after generation. You will die out. And so obviously that's not the case. I actually find that it's better that doctors aren't taught nutrition, because we'd be taught the wrong nutrition, right? We're taught a whole bunch of plant-based nonsense and just reinforce this. It would be exactly the same. I mean, it's not like it's any different. It's not like nutritionists are coming out going like, oh my God, no, we should all be carnivores. They're all saying we should be vegan, because that's what they're getting taught, right? And so you have a nutritionist who's promoting a diet that is lacking in basic essential nutrients. It's in the name, nutritionist, nutrients. You need nutrients, right? And yet these different nutritional bodies are pushing plant-based vegan diets. But why are they doing that? Because they're heavily funded by the plant-based processed food industry, like Kellogg's, like Sanitarium, like Nestle, like Coca-Cola and Pepsi, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's who pays these people, and that's who pulls their strings. And that's why you'll see them pushing a plant-based diet, because these processed food companies make massive, massive profits off of their plant-based products. So ready-made meals, all these other sorts of things, but just junk food too, potato chips, etc. And they know that statistically, when people go vegan, they don't all go to like fresh quinoa salads and sprouted alfalfa. No, they eat junk food. They eat potato chips and Oreo cookies, which are vegan, by the way. And so, it's just marketing and propaganda. They're trying to push their product. They're trying to sell more of this garbage. It is a drug. They use multiple drugs that are known to be addictive. That are known drugs like sugar. Sugar is a known drug. It's a known addictive drug, addictive substance. They put in caffeine, a known drug, an addictive substance, and it's to compel you to continue to eat their product. They have food scientists who are very clever people. When Philip Morris and the other tobacco companies started tanking in the 80s because the bag came out that they've been lying for decades about how dangerous tobacco was. They were the largest companies on earth. They were the largest, most wealthy companies on earth. So I said, okay, well, we need to diversify now. That's what they did, is they went into the processed food industry and they bought up Kraft and a bunch of other big companies. And they became the largest processed food manufacturer on earth. And they moved these thousands of scientists from the tobacco industry over to the food industry. And they were in the tobacco industry trying to make it more and more addictive and compulsive, and so that people just smoked and smoked and smoked and smoked and smoked, so that they sold more product, because that's all they cared about. They cared about selling that $3.50 pack of cigarettes, and they wanted you just to buy more and more and more of those things. And now it's like $20 a pack because of the taxes. But they don't care that people are suffering and dying as a result of it. In fact, they knew that was happening, which is why I don't think they should have gotten a civil slap on the wrist. I mean, it's $400 billion, but who cares? They made trillions over the years, and they killed hundreds of millions of people prematurely and caused disease in probably a few billion who were smokers at the time. And they knew it. They knew this was causing disease. They knew this was causing harm, emphysema and cancer, etc., peripheral vascular disease and heart disease. They knew it. They had their own documents, their own memos that were leaked out to Congress, the U.S. Congress, that they said that specifically. They knew all this was happening, which is why they got that $400 billion fine. And why didn't they face criminal charges? They knowingly killed people. They knowingly caused massive burdens of disease and illness on a global scale. I mean, this is mass genocide at this point. These are crimes against humanity. We should have had another Nuremberg trial and actually strung these guys up and executed them with a firing squad. Seriously, these guys should have faced harsh criminal penalties because of this, or at least a trial. It should have at least been manifested criminal charges because of this. And now we're getting the same thing. So these guys took all their scientists and making tobacco more and more addictive and breeding up more and more nicotine in the tobacco and all these other sorts of things, and all these different processes to make it faster and more efficient and more profitable and end up being more harmful. So they took all those guys, those very clever people, put these guys into food sciences, and to then do that, to try to make food as addictive as possible, and try to put these different substances that trigger something called the bliss point that makes your brain just go, ooh, eat this, more of that now, please. And you eat that because your brain thinks you're getting something really good for you, goes into your stomach. You actually have receptors in your stomach that track the macro and micronutrients that are in your stomach, and that sends a signal up to the brain via the vagus nerve. And your brain actually sees how many nutrients you have there. So you get this, ooh, that tastes really good, that's good for you taste, but then it goes in your stomach, and your stomach goes, there's nothing here. Like your body tracks nutrients, it does not track calories. And so it's not seeing any nutrients, and it's getting these bliss point hits, and have these chemicals actually disrupt our normal satiety signals. So we overeat, and we keep eating, and we use more of their product and buy more of their product, and they sell more, and that's better for their bottom line. And that's all there is to it. They just want to sell more. They want to sell more potato chips. They have these, they don't even hide it in their advertising. It's like Pringles, bet you can't eat just one. He's like, I bet you think that because you've designed it like that. you know? And so, it's those are the people funding the nutrition courses and the nutritional colleges. And there was they've come after a number of doctors, such as Dr. Gary Fetkkey here in Australia. He's an orthopedic surgeon. He was putting people on ketogenic diets to reverse their diabetes, and it was reversing their diabetes. And now it's in the national guidelines in Australia to treat diabetes. It's considered best practice to put diabetics on a ketogenic diet. He was doing this well ahead of his time, and he was reversing diabetes and making it so these people didn't need amputations anymore, because he was an orthopedic surgeon and he had to do these foot and leg amputations, and he said it was just horrible. It was a terrible, just hearing a human foot fall into a trash can after you've cut it off. It's just a terrible sound that you just can't get out of your head. And he's like, okay, don't want to do that anymore. And so he's getting these people to change their diet, and it was actually completely turning them around and saving these people's life and their health. And they came after him. In fact, a medical group here in Australia actually sued for the minutes of a certain cereal company and got the minutes. And they actually saw in there that they said, this damn ketogenic diet movement is killing our cereal sales. We need to shut it up. We need to, sort of, show that it's, try to disqualify it, all these sort of things. And so they named specific doctors around the world who were pushing this and say, we need to discredit these people. We need to get their licenses taken away and say that these are just a phony and a fraud and a quack so that we can go on with this. Right. And they named Gary Fetkkey by name. And it's not like he had a massive, social media presence. He had 4,000 people that followed him on Instagram. It was, I don't know how he got on their radar, but they tapped the Australian Dietetics Associations, who they're the major funders of. And the head of the Australian Dietetics Association, the head of the Australian Dietetics Association then called the head of Gary Fettkey's hospital and said, you need to shut this guy up and shut him down. And so they started trying to work against him to get his medical license pulled. Right. And so that's who these people are. So thank God that those guys don't have a say in what gets taught in medical school, because it would just be reinforcing that same whole garbage, and it would just be even more entrenched in people's minds as they come out of medical school. So, at least there's not that.
Yeah, and you tell someone that, and they'll call you a conspiracy theorist.
It's all in the literature. This is all published data.
Yeah.
It's like there.
Yeah. But people just are so blind to it. And just, propaganda is a powerful thing.
Well, all you have to do is look at the main donors for the Australian Dietetics Association and the American Dietetics Association, and different European groups and every country. Who funds these people? It's the same. It's the usual suspects. It's Nestle. It's Coke. It's Pepsi. It's Pfizer. It's Moderna. It's all these other places. It's all the food and drug companies, and Bayer. Monsanto, all these sorts of things. They are the ones who are the major funders of these things. They're the major funders for medical conferences. When you go to a mainstream medical conference, you will see who the donors are. It is the big food and drug companies, all the processed garbage food companies, and all of the major pharmaceutical companies. That's who funds these places. And of course, because their money talks, they have a say in who gets to present papers and literature and publications at those conferences. And, it's not really going to deviate too far from the mainstream.
Yeah, my theory, my own conspiracy theory is that, it obviously benefits the medical industry when more people are sick. And so why would the medical industry want to cure disease? You want to keep people alive, but just kind of keep them ticking along so that the money keeps coming in. And so it would make perfect sense for me that, the food industry and the medical industry work together to kind of create this cycle of money coming in, sick people, but, so they're living for a slightly shorter lifespan, but, it's just a endless stream of revenue. And if they could cure disease just by diet, that would be not a very savvy move from a financial standpoint.
Yeah, the thing is too is that these food and drug companies are actually, they're quite incestuous because they actually are very heavily invested in each other, right? And so, that sort of makes you a bit suspicious that, they're sort of profiting off of each other's industries. The food companies making people sick, and then the drug companies, treating that sickness. But as far as curing disease, no, you are completely right in that regard. In fact, that's come out. There's sort of these things that were leaked from Goldman Sachs, an investment company. There was a meeting that people took a picture of the slide, and it went viral. Said, is curing someone of a disease a viable business model? And the answer, of course, was no, because the money is in the comeback. Like any good drug dealer, you have to keep people coming back for your product. If you gave someone a bag of heroin that kept them high the rest of their life, or not needing heroin, like, you're out of business, so, you need them to come back and come back and come back. And so, the angle is not to cure disease. The angle is to treat the disease and make it more tolerable so that you can live with it, but never cure it. Chris Rock said this in a stand-up routine he did in the 1990s. He said, they're never going to cure AIDS. What was the last thing doctors cured? Polio, and like they're not curing this because the money's in the return customer and coming back. The money's in the treatment, not in the cure. And there's so they're never going to cure AIDS. They're never going to cure these other things because they're still pissed at all the money they lost from polio. And he said, it's like the car industry. We have spaceships that are like circling around Jupiter and going into the outer orbits of this galaxy or the solar system and trying to go beyond. And it's like, you're telling me that we can't make a Cadillac whose bumper doesn't fall off? Like, you're kidding me. So like they can, but they won't do it because they make more money if you come back with a problem, buy a new car, and get your bumper fixed. And so that's the thing. There's, I think it was called Gilead. I remember this. There was a company I think I was an intern back in like 2013. Pretty sure I was an intern. I'm pretty sure it was Gilead. They came out with this drug that it was actually a cure for hepatitis C, which you've only been able to treat. It's just like it's incurable up until then. And then all of a sudden they had this cure that was coming out. And I remember reading about that. I was just like, oh, that's probably a good company to invest in because it's as a cure for hepatitis C. And like, there's a lot of people with hepatitis C. So this is a big deal. And they actually got in trouble by like Goldman Sachs. And then they actually, these documents got leaked. I'm pretty sure it was Goldman Sachs. And they actually excoriated them and said, hey, this is not what we want. You messed up here. You don't want to cure. We don't want to cure these things, because now you're screwed up because we had treatments that just go on for decades. And then you have to treat these people forever. But if you cure them, that's it. It's done. So you shouldn't have done that. You shouldn't look for cures. You should look for treatment. And that of course is completely antithetical to the actual medical establishment, the actual, doctors and researchers who are actually trying to better human health. This is a very ghoulish, predatory sort of behavior that has absolutely no business being a part of the medical establishment, but we need to recognize that is their motivation, right? And so that's their motivation. Fine. We don't look to them for cures. We know they are not going to try to find a cure. So we need to find a cure. We need to look into these things. And so that's just fine. That's just information that we need. But, we can't let these people dictate the medical establishment, the medical sciences, and the medical, and the medical education, because they are very conflicted. They have a serious conflict of interest because they want disease to perpetuate so that they can just treat it and make massive amounts of money. They don't want to cure these things. So they should absolutely no say in the curriculum of medical schools. I mean, Jesus, that is just so backwards to have that. I was speaking to a cardiologist this weekend, and he was saying that, drug companies are not even bothering them anymore about prescribing statins because they're off patent, right? So they're not making huge dollars out of these things anymore. They still make a lot of money, but it's nothing close to what they have. But they have these other drugs on patent. So now they have these drugs that attack your body's ability to make cholesterol even more. And that's what statins do too. But these are the new drug and they're on patent. So that's what you got to push out. And the only reason they're pushing these out is the next big thing, even though they do relatively similar things as statins, it's just because they're on patent and they're really expensive, right? And so that's why they're super important and good and wonderful. But they do aggressively lower your body's ability to make cholesterol. You need cholesterol. Your body's made out of cholesterol. I learned that in 8th grade. I remember seeing that in a textbook in my biology class, that the lipid bilayer that makes up the cell membrane in our bodies is a lipid bilayer of cholesterol molecules. So we are literally made out of cholesterol. Our hormones are made out of cholesterol. Our brain is largely made out of cholesterol. Every cell in our body is made out of cholesterol. Bile is made out of cholesterol. Different molecules that communicate in between different cells are made out of cholesterol. So how is it that cholesterol is somehow bad for us? How is it that our own natural production of cholesterol is somehow an inbuilt flaw, design flaw that is just going to kill us, right? That's what they're arguing. And it is an absurd statement just on its face, even without looking at the evidence, and the evidence is robustly against them. But now they're saying, this is my cardiologist colleague was saying, that now they're trying to push for lower and lower and lower LDL targets, saying, no, you have to even get it basically, less than half of what we say now you should get it under, because these new drugs can really lower the hell out of your cholesterol. And he's saying that they're telling us to lower these things past the point of physiology. Like no one would ever be physiologically at these low levels, but they're saying, no, that's even better because your body is just built wrong. And just nature is just screwed up, and we're actually just these flawed entities, and that you need these drugs. And thank goodness they came around to make these drugs, because we're all just dropping like flies before they showed up. And they want you to lower your cholesterol even further. They're talking about lowering the blood pressure targets as well, trying to get that down to 115, 110. Well, because you sign up another 30% of the population who needs blood pressure medication, right? So now you've got another 400 million people that are paying for your drugs. So this is drug dealer 101. You just get people hooked, get them addicted, get them stuck, and get them dependent on your poison so that you can keep making money. In another way, like they did in the Supernova trial, where they took ketogenic athletes and they said, okay, you go, or they took athletes and said, okay, you drop the carbs, go keto. But they only gave them 2 weeks. And then they tested them sort of, very quickly after a couple of weeks. They also didn't